Hi friends, this is going to be a quick intro. It's just a segment by Abby Martin that I saw on Breakthrough News, and she was talking about all kinds of different points about US imperialism, and she covered just about every country that is in the crosshairs of the US empire, so it's worthwhile checking out. So I threw that together. I think she always has great insights. Abby Martin is the host of the Empire Files that I mention regularly on this channel, Faint Signals from Vega. And then at the end of that, there is a Gabriel Rockhill, who is he's an author and obviously a socialist, and he talks about being anti-imperialist and what we need to do to have a revolution, which must be anti-imperialist. He doesn't necessarily say that it must be a socialist system after that, but he says it must be anti-imperialist. So he does this great little spiel. It's about 5 minutes, 7 minutes. So both those things together, Abby Martin is anti-imperialist. I think it's sort of a moral imperative. I think at this point, with the death drive, the ecocidal system of capitalism, we need to be anti-capitalist. So anyway, and another thing I wanted to mention while I'm here talking about anti-capitalism, anti-capitalist positions. As you probably heard, I mention MMT, which is simply a description of the operational reality of a sovereign economy. And you may have heard Dr. Stephanie Kelton, who was Bernie Sanders' economic advisor in 2016 and 2020. Dr. Stephanie Kelton is a proponent of MMT, which is, as I've already described what it is simply. She's, outlined how there are, Medicare for all could easily be brought in to, for everybody, particularly in a pandemic. And of course, you've probably heard about the Yale study, which I mentioned before, which says that the US could save $450 billion, billion with a B, and save the lives of 67,000 people a year if they brought in Medicare for all. So two things: the economy can afford Medicare for all; it can afford that for everybody. And the US, I think, is the only Western country that doesn't have Medicare for all, universal health care, which is ridiculous. And secondly, the economy could afford it. Firstly, the economy could afford it, and secondly, they definitely could afford it because they would actually save $450 billion and the lives of 67,000 people a year. So why don't they do it? Well, if you watch this channel, you know, but they're an inverted totalitarian state, and the oligarchy and the corporations, the 1%, the capitalist class, they rule with austerity that kills people. But I brought this up because there's an organization called RIP Medical Debt, which I saw which I saw today on the live stream of Lee Camp and Eleanor Goldfield. And Lee Camp is the host of Redacted Tonight. He also has a YouTube channel called Moment of Clarity, and he does something with Graham Elwood, I think, it's Government Secrets. He does numerous different things, but they were raising money for RIP Medical Debt, and how it works is, well, I won't go into exactly how it works. I'll leave a link in the live stream chat and in the information section of this video. But apparently, if you give, say, $100, it actually ends up becoming $10,000, and that debt is wiped off of people who are struggling the most in the United States with medical debt, very low income families and all of that. And they've apparently at this point basically written off $3 billion worth, billion with a B, dollars worth of debt of US citizens. So it's very interesting, and I won't explain how that works, but it sounds very good, and I assume that Lee Camp and Eleanor Goldfield, since they were raising money for that, have looked into it and researched it to make sure it's all on the up and up, and it's it's a good organization. So I'm taking their word for it. So you may want to consider. I think you can actually make tax-deductible donations, and it just sounds. I mean, of course, everybody should have free health care. It's healthcare is a right, but unfortunately, right at this time, the U.S. does not have. Most citizens do not have free health. Well, they don't have free health care, but most citizens cannot afford health insurance. And even when they have health insurance, they can't afford the premiums. So they may as well not have it at all. So in the meantime, while the U.S. is struggling to get something that all other Western countries have, it would be great to actually support something like this RIP medical debt, if one can. And maybe one day I'll do a live stream and see if I can, maybe see if I can get some people in the live stream and make some donations, and then we could maybe knock off some medical debt of somebody who is basically, it's a case of food and medicine or paying off their, their debt. It's absolutely disgusting. But right at the present time, particularly in the pandemic, there are so many people now food insecure, on the verge of eviction or have been evicted and so forth. There's unemployment by the tens of millions. So there are people, we will never know the amount of suffering that this duopoly has caused. The Democratic Party and the GOP have caused 300, most of the population of the United States, 330 million. We'll never know the singular stories of every family and every couple, every single person in the United States that has suffered due to the kleptocracy that is the duopoly. So this is one way, I guess, of trying to address some of that, and it seems like it's a good organization, RIP Medical Debt, so maybe check that out. So anyway, that's all I really wanted to say. Check out these next two excerpts. Abby Martin's is about 15-20 minutes, and Gabrielle Rockhill is about 10 minutes all up, I think. So anyway, thanks for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. I hope you are well. Please join my Substack. It's faintsignalsfromvega.substack, substack.com, and if you join that, if I happen to, my channel at some point gets into trouble and they decide to delete it, or because of algorithms which already suppress it pretty badly and censor the content because it's mostly anti-imperialist, if it gets to the point where it just looks like it's just not going anywhere at all, then or being deleted, the account is deleted, then I can still keep in touch with people, and that's the reason why I have this Substack account. So please consider subscribing to it. It's faintsignalsfromvega.substack.com, and I'll try to do my best to only make it two emails a week, which will have maybe two to three videos in it. And also I will give it probably one email at any time that we're going to do a live stream, so that we don't have to rely on the very poor notifications that YouTube gives people. I mean, I've subscribed to somebody and I clicked the notifications bell and I got one video from them in about 9 months. I'd forgotten even that I'd subscribed to them. So that's how YouTube is, and how it is with particularly with people who are talking about topics that they don't want you to talk about. Because it interferes with the U.S. national security state's warmongering. And also, I've had a look at the list of some of the list of the words that are used, the words that cause demonetization on YouTube, and there's a whole lot of them, and some are ridiculous. But I've seen things like Palestine. Not that I've monetized very few on my channel, and that really was to see if the algorithms would change a bit, because YouTube is motivated by profit, but that didn't seem to work anyway. But they're older videos. But there are these ridiculous amount of words that cause demonetization. And, things like the word Iraq, that kind of thing. Afghanistan is another one. So there are things you can see by the names of countries that are, U.S. imperialism is there, that they are, the YouTube, you can see what their motivations are, the words that they've decided that are problematic. Okay, so thanks for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time, bye for now.
I think it's a great start. This is something that Biden was promising during his campaign. This is one of the few changes that we were expecting to happen under his tenure, and he immediately fulfilled, at least temporarily, those weapon shipments to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, which I think is a huge move. And everyone gave Trump credit for supposedly being anti-war, when we can't forget that he vetoed that bill that tried to end those U.S. weapon shipments. So this is really just aiding and abetting genocide. I mean, it's sad that it had to get to this point where tens of millions of people are starving to death in Yemen. There is a small caveat that I heard Blinken talking about potentially sanctioning the Houthis, rebels on the ground. He claims that the Houthis control 80% of Yemeni territory. I don't know how true that is, but so there is something there to be said about what exactly will that mean moving forward with humanitarian assistance that they so desperately need. And also, of course, this doesn't deter the support, the staunch support for Saudi Arabia in general. So this has already been reiterated by Anthony Blinken, saying, of course, we need Saudi Arabia to carry out counterterrorism measures in the region. So this is just an end to the offensive, logistical, tactical support, and of course the weapons, because it was much more than weapons that the U.S. was doing to help kill Yemenis. And also Blinken reiterated the fact that we are going to also help Riyadh with defense against Houthi attacks on the border. This is your classic neoliberal interventionist, right? So to mask all the language and humanitarianism, but really when you unmask who he is, he's just the same old good old boy that essentially Mike Pompeo was, just with more gentle language and maybe not the religious zealotry, but who knows. So yeah, I mean, Blinken is so far a complete and total disaster. I mean, what I think people need to remember is that he was actually Biden's closest foreign policy advisor when Biden championed the invasion of Iraq. So this is something that is such a horrible legacy for anyone. They have to completely denounce their support for Iraq at this point. And the fact that he was in Biden's ear when Biden was leading the charge for the Democratic support, I think is something that really needs to be said about who Blinken is at his core, not to mention the hardline support for the war in Libya against Muammar Gaddafi. And also he says that the U.S. didn't go far enough in Syria. He is an advocate of regime change there. So we could see some ugly maneuvering in Syria as well. And we also have to look at his shadowy past at West Exec Advisors. This is kind of a modeling off the Kissinger and Associates group that literally claimed to help defense corporations market their products to the Pentagon. So, I mean, at the end of the day, you're going to see a lot of unification with the most imperialist warmongers on the Republican side when it comes to Latin America, China, and the Middle East, unfortunately. In the most egregious cases, they cheered on Trump's atrocities and war crimes all across the world when Trump was president for 4 years. And this is the thing that really irks me, is that Trump exacerbated drone strikes 300%. Trump added hundreds of genocidal sanctions on countries all around the world, bringing people to the brink of starvation in many countries. Just absolutely horrific, sadistic stuff there, Eugene. And what I find bizarre is that the Biden administration has not talked about any of these things. They've not talked about reining any of these policies back. And so what they're doing is re-inheriting, because we're talking about the Obama administration really overseeing that killer drone empire, Trump expanding it to record levels and making it way less accountable. And now you have Biden's team coming in, overseeing a less accountable, widely expansive drone empire. All of these sanctions, we already know when it comes to Iran, they're stripping the negotiations and saying, no, you need to capitulate to our demands and these benchmarks that we're not going to drop any of the sanctions. Trump put 800 plus sanctions on Iran. I mean, that is absolutely insane. So Blinken and all of Biden's foreign policy advisors are not talking about any of these things. And we even see Jen Psaki talking about how excited she is about overseeing the Space Force. I mean, this is not just a joke. I know it's like a show on TV and it's just like some big comical thing about Trump. But really, when you look at what Space Force is, not only is it a boon to the military-industrial complex, but it also is violating several treaties and starting a new arms war. Absolutely, which is why it's also very problematic that Biden is having a more hostile front toward Russia. I mean, this is a nuclear-armed country. They have the second largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world. And instead of rehabilitating the relationship, because Trump certainly wasn't good on Russia, even though everyone painted him as a Putin puppet, Biden is taking this aggressive stance and Blinken is taking this aggressive stance, and it's just absolutely outrageous. We need to be talking to these leaders. We need to be talking about scaling down these absurd arsenals of nuclear weapons and essentially, at the end of the day, obliterating them all, because we're never going to really be safe with all of these nukes on the planet, Eugene. But one thing you mentioned earlier was the bipartisan kind of uniformity when it comes to the foreign policy establishment approach. And I can't think of a better example than Venezuela. It's absolutely disgusting and reprehensible what Biden is doing. Not only did he cater to like the right wing, Venezuelans his entire campaign, but he immediately, as one of his first acts, recognized Juan Guaido. This guy isn't even a legislator in Venezuela anymore. Like, who is this person? And also Blinken signaling to Marco Rubio, the most abhorrent of all figures in Venezuela, who actually tweeted a open lynch threat against Maduro during the coup attempt, akin to the lynching of Muammar Gaddafi. And his account was actually fine, and it's still active on Twitter. But Blinken signaled to him and just said, I can't wait to work with you on Venezuela. So we're going to have to really build the pressure there to prevent another immediate coup attempt under Biden. And you saw Blinken actually in an interview with Andrea Mitchell just recently basically say just that. I mean, we are the arbiters of human rights and democracy, and Trump eroded that, and we need to re-implement that. And that's why he was most worried, it seemed, about the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, because it, made the image of America falter around the world, and he really wants to reassert that so they can get back to business. Biden infamously said he didn't want to move the embassy back, so he is going to stay with that policy that was an absolutely disastrous policy that we saw prompt the entire Great March of Return. Of course, that was, facilitated our movie, Gaza Fights for Freedom. Tens of thousands of Palestinians were unarmed, marching to the partition fence that separates them from their ancestral lands, and they were mowed down by Israeli snipers. A lot of them were wounded, but a lot of them were also killed extrajudicially. This was something that was all sparked by the moving of the embassy. Now, of course, Biden is saying he doesn't want to recognize anything else. The only thing that I think we will see a difference on Palestine is potentially refunding the UNRWA aid that Trump ripped out under refugees. That was absolutely devastating to people who needed immediate access to medical care and other types of aid. And so hopefully Biden will reinstate that. That is very, very urgently needed for the millions of refugees in Gaza and elsewhere. But as far as anything else, no. I mean, Biden has bragged for years about being a staunch Zionist. He has a 100% rating from AIPAC. We're not going to see anything else change on that front. This is why Breakthrough News is so crucial, and people really need to spread the word, because it's one of the best alternative media platforms out there. And in terms of how the media will shift their tone with Biden, I think we're going to see exactly what we saw during the lead up to the election, Eugene. I mean, during his entire primary campaign, they were totally uncritical. There was no coverage of him being a serial plagiarist or pathological liar, or, rape allegations against him. It was, of course, all centered, the ire was all centered on Bernie Sanders, and we saw how that turned out. So we're going to see the same exact tone be taken during Biden's entire administration. I mean, let's face it, Trump tapped into this kind of growing distrust of the corporate media, calling everything that wasn't sycophantic coverage of him fake news. And I think that what that did ultimately was undermine and delegitimize the corporate media to the extent that they were just obsessed with him, because they consider themselves, of course, the end-all be-all, truth tellers, right? Like, and everything kind of goes back to these corporate media narratives, whether you're looking at, the algorithms changing or how Wikipedia is structured, all of these things. So they were absolutely insulted and devastated at that. But that wasn't the reason why they obsessively covered Trump. It was because he was a boon for their advertising structure and for their ratings. They saw ratings like none other when Trump was president. So, of course, they couldn't get out of their own way with constantly covering every single thing he did, even though we saw how that turned out. He was able to basically tap into their faults and spread so much right-wing propaganda that you have half of the country just not believing in COVID, protesting the vaccine. We just saw a huge protest in LA against the vaccination center. This is the effect of Trumpism, and also not just his right-wing media sphere, but the corporate media in general, covering him nonstop. These press conferences, the talking points, the tweets, and not having any sort of retrospective, like no accountability of how we got Trump, So now it's just this huge sigh of relief. Well, now it's back to sanity and civility, because the corporate media is an arm of the empire. They're an arm of the Pentagon. And all they want is to basically reassure people that everything's back to normal now. Trump is out. They're desperate for this return to normalcy because Trump threw the emphasis array, and that's really what shook the establishment to its core the most. But Eugene, we saw the corporate media covered Trump when it came to his war crimes. They were near tears. Brian Williams, Fareed Zakaria saying this is when Trump became president. So we're going to go back to the same sort of imperialist warmongering, but again, through the lens of humanitarianism, just the way they like it. Yeah, that's what we've seen. Ever since Trump won, they couldn't blame the system. They couldn't blame neoliberalism. They couldn't blame themselves. So they had to point to fake news, right? In general, the Pizzagate phenomenon, all of these things that erupted from the WikiLeaks files on Podesta. And that led to this kind of fallout from Russiagate in general that I was actually in part a victim of, where the DNI report came out. This joint report that basically blamed Russia Today and a bunch of other nonsense for giving us Trump and aiding and abetting sowing radical discontent and discord among the American public. And it pointed from everything from Black Lives Matter activists to Occupy Wall Street people to it was so absurd. But what it resulted in, Eugene, was Google changing the algorithm and making websites like Counterpunch, like World Socialist website, all these websites that ran counter to the corporate media narrative about capitalism and empire were essentially backpaged into oblivion, where you can't even find these websites anymore unless you are looking specifically for them. If you're doing research on an issue, you get corporate media for the first 5 pages. It is really, really sad because a lot of people don't even realize that this happened. And like you mentioned, social media giants have curated our reality for the last couple of years, and it's becoming more and more insulated, where now you have something like the Alliance for Securing Democracy, who actually Jake Sullivan, one of Biden's another foreign policy team, is actually on the think tank board of, along with other very sinister officials, that also has this black box algorithm that determines who is and who is not a Russian bot and essentially just scrapes their account. So while there is every news story about purging right-wing accounts or QAnon or Trump himself, who has now become the martyr and somehow this breaking point of the slippery slope of the internet of tech censorship, this has been going on for years against leftists, against communists, against government officials in other countries, Chavistas, Iranian officials. I mean, this has been happening for so long that it's hard to find sympathy for Trump specifically when leftists have really been the ultimate targets for censorship. And unfortunately, it's not going to stop because we know that is ultimately the target and the goal of these tech giants working in concert with the government. That's a really good question. I know that there is an election coming up where I think the socialist is poised to win, which would be huge because we know Lenin Moreno completely sold out Julian Assange in the entire country, essentially, where Korea, I think, still has an arrest warrant out for him if he returns to the country that he oversaw so many advances in. So it's a really good point. I think that to instruct what Biden will do, we can just look at his policy toward Latin America in general. And unfortunately, it's very anti-communist. And I fear that he is not going to be good at all and potentially stage some sort of coup attempt or undermine the pending election of this socialist figure in Ecuador.
Before I let you get out of here, just real quickly, where can people find and support the work that y'all are doing on the Empire Files?
Check out YouTube while we're still up before we get taken down. YouTube.com/EmpireFiles, theempirefiles.tv, GazaFightsForFreedom.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at Abby Martin. Thank you so much, Eugene, and the team at Breakthrough. Can't wait to join you guys again.
Basically, there has to be a revolution, right?
Right.
So what form does that take, and how does it look, and how are we going to get there? And I couldn't agree more that that's the real question, because the pessimistic kind of sideline approach where you just stand back and describe how screwed we are as the train goes screeching into a concrete wall is not particularly helpful. And at the end of the day, the world that is going to be made in the future, right? Like you were referencing Australia here and them being kind of out in front of us, at least in the time zones, that world is a world that's going to be made a struggle. And it depends on what we do. And I would say at least two things. One is I fully agree that the American empire has entered into and has been for quite some time now into a phase of decadence. It is crumbling and it cannot maintain its power in the same way that it could in earlier eras, and that's a very, very good thing. But it does also mean that the ruling class, in order to consolidate its power, will resort to new and different tactics. I'd give a shout out here to the great book by William I. Robinson called The Global Police State, where he talks about militarized accumulation and the increased investment in the military and in really draconian policing tactics globally as a site to make profit and also to crush revolutionary insurgencies. And so that process of decadence means that the ruling class has a problem on its hands, and it's got to find ways of solving that. And so the resurgence of these more authoritarian or fascist modes of governance around the world are related to that problem. The other thing that I think is really important to highlight is that the ecological crisis is of such extreme proportions that it is very clear that in the coming years, there's a choice to be made, and that is humanity going to survive in some form, or is it not? And so I am absolutely 100% convinced that capitalism is going to collapse, and the real question is whether or not it takes all of us with it, because capitalism will destroy the conditions of possibility of human existence. That's what it's doing on planet Earth. It's not just us as humans, right? It's the biosphere, and so this is all kind of prefacing then the real question is, well, then how do we build power? And I think it's really important to recognize that the mechanisms of political representation that we have in this country are absolutely corrupt. There's not a way of reforming them. And we have to do what has been done, because there's lots of models for this elsewhere in the world. And that is build real socialist power in anti-capitalist organizations that are driven from the ground up and that begin to mobilize people, as we're already doing. I'm involved with these organizations myself, and from what I understand about your work, you are as well. We've got to build that power. We've got to do it quickly, and we've got to we've got to tap into the deep history of socialist organizing to find the best tactics and the best strategies for getting us to a place where we can fight and really win in the kind of belly of the imperial beast in the United States. The organizations that I'm involved with are really looking at, if you start to get into the concrete aspects of it, a lot of socialist organizing in the United States at one point was based on sites of production because there were factories and things in the United States. But through the globalization of production chains, a lot of that production has been moved out of the United States. And so if you want to build like working class power, one way of doing that is through neighborhood community organizing. And so one of the organizations that I work with, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, we do a lot of community organizing that is about a number of different things. One of them is demonstrating to people how a socialist party that is driven by people power would actually deal with various crises. So we run an US program, which is a unity and survival program that brings free groceries to families in need throughout the entire time of the pandemic. And that is not simply, it's not an act of charity. It is a form of mutual aid, but mutual aid to build power in order to demonstrate to people what a socialist government would look like, and also to bring people into that struggle. We also do a lot of political education so people can have their minds opened up beyond the kind of spectrum of the Democratic Party and maybe its progressive wing and some other things. But two, there's a ton of, anti-capitalist parties and anti-capitalist organizations that are out there. We also, of course, do a lot around anti-racist organizing, anti-fascist organizing. And I could kind of go on at length about the various projects that we're involved in, but maybe the easiest thing to do would be encourage people who are interested, check out the Party for Socialism and Liberation, check out the Liberation Center in Philadelphia and what we've been up to there. And there's lots of other great orgs that are out there. I think that, for my taste at least, the most important thing is anti-capitalist. At least begin with that. And maybe one other thing that I would say, and I'm not sure if we're on the same page about this, and push back if you disagree, but there are certain forms of socialism that think that the ruling class can be voted out of power. And if someone could give me an example of that, historically, I might eventually be convinced, but I know of no single historical example where the ruling class was voted out of power and stayed out of power, right? There are some instances where there were really progressive parties that work through electoral mechanisms. And I do believe in working through tactically, not strategically, like you use the electoral system, but strategically. At the end of the day, we need a system change. And the ruling class is not going to allow that to happen through the ballot box at the end of the day, right? We can do that to build power, but at the end of the day, we're talking about real class struggle.